Hello there. So far, we have been talking about sequential statements, where what happens is we have a Java program which has got a bunch of statements. And when we execute that Java program, each of these statements gets executed one after the other. And that is why it is called sequential statements. Now, sequential statements can help us solve a lot of problems that we would want to solve with Java. For example, this one where we are taking two numbers as an input from the user, then we are adding those numbers, and finally we are printing the sum. By the way, this is one of the many questions that is solved in the last video. And all the questions that I solved in the last video are based around sequential statements itself. So if the list seems interesting, you can check the video out by clicking the card that's appearing over here. Now, coming back to our discussion, we've got sequential statements, and I said that it will not always be helpful. For example, what if I want to execute these three statements if and only if a condition is met? Or what if I want to execute these three statements, say 4 times or 5 times for whatsoever reason? In that case, sequential will not be useful. And that is where the control statements provided and supported by Java comes into picture. Now, there are three control statements in total that Java supports, and they are selection, iteration, and jump. Selection statements allow a program to choose a different path of execution that is based upon the outcome of an expression or the state of a variable. Now, if the definition of selection statement did not make sense, don't worry. Selection statement is what we are going to cover in this video. And by the end, everything will make sense. Coming to iteration statements, these are the statements that enables our program to execute one or more than one statements for a certain number of times. Lastly, we have got jump statements. Now, I'll not even attempt to explain what jump statements are in this video because I might end up confusing you, but we are going to have dedicated videos on iteration and jump statement. In this video, however, we are going to focus on selection statements. Now, coming to selection statements, we can categorize selection statements into two broad categories, and they are if and switch. And if itself has got a lot of variations, 4 to be precise: the simple if, the if else, the if else if ladder, and the nested if. And because if itself has got 4 variations, we will focus our attention solely to if statement. The next video will be dedicated to switch statement. So with that said and done, let's get started, and let's get started with the simplest of the if, that is simple if. Now what you see in front of you is the syntax of simple if. It starts with the if keyword, and then there's a pair of parentheses with a condition in it. Then you can see a block over here, and you can identify that this is a block because there's an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. And inside the block, we have got a few statements. Now let's dissect the syntax and let's understand each of the elements one by one. First of all, of course, is the if keyword, which signifies that this is a simple if. Now, the condition that you see over here could be any expression that returns a Boolean value, which means the condition should evaluate to either true or false. Now, this could be in many ways, right? You can either put the literal itself, that is true or false, or you can have a variable which is of Boolean type and which holds either true or false, and that variable can be put over here, or you can have an expression that ultimately resolves to either a true or a false. But either way, the point to note over here is that this should be a Boolean value, so either a true or false. Now, depending on whether it is true or false, this block will be executed or won't be executed. To put it in better terms, if the condition evaluates to true, the block that is associated to if gets executed. But if it is false, this block won't be executed. Now, I've been mentioning about the block being surrounded with curly braces and the block having a few statements. But I should also tell you that the curly braces that you see over here are optional, which means even if you don't have these curly braces, the program will work just fine in most of the cases. So you would need the curly braces if you have got more than one statements in the body of if. If there's only one statement, you don't need these curly braces. But if you ask me, I will recommend that you always use curly braces no matter how many statements you have in the body of if. And if you ask me why, the short answer is that it is considered a good programming practice. And the long answer is it is considered a good programming practice because it makes the code easy to understand and easy to maintain. Now, like this, there are a lot of other practices that are considered good programming practices. I'm of course not going to talk about that in this video so that we don't divert from the main topic. But if you're interested, please let me know and I'll make a separate video on that topic. Coming back to this, we have curly braces, and these curly braces will be required if the body of if is supposed to have more than one statement. If it is supposed to have only one statement, you can omit these curly braces. Now, having understood the syntax of simple if, let's go to IntelliJ and let's write some code. For that, the first thing that I'll do is create a package, and I'll name the package as selection statements. And inside this package, I'll have a Java class. I'll name this class as simple if example. Over here, I'll have a main method. Then I'm going to have if. Now we know that if needs a condition, and that condition should be a Boolean value ultimately. So let's have a variable called, let's say, result. Let's assign false to it for now. And let's use the result in if. Now what do we know about if is if the result evaluates to true, the body that is associated to if gets executed. So let's have just one statement in the body. And because we are going to have just one statement in the body, I'm omitting the curly braces for now. And let's say I print true. So if I run the code, what do you expect as the output? Well, result contains false, and we are going for if result. That is, the value of result is false. And since the value of result is false, from what we know, this statement, that is system.out.println true, should not be getting executed. So let's run the code and check. And that's exactly what happened. The program compiled and executed successfully because we can see it says process finished with exit code 0. But there's nothing getting printed on the screen. And that is because the only print statement that we have in our program will get printed if the value of result is true. But it is false right now. So if I change this to true and then run the code, I get true printed, right? Now, there's one point that I mentioned about curly braces, and that is if you have more than one statement which you want to be inside the body of if, then you should use curly braces. Actually, you have to use curly braces. Otherwise, it won't work the way you expect it to. For example, let's say I add another print statement and I say, for example, another statement. Now, there are two statements, right? Let's indent it so that it looks like it is inside the if. Now the result is true. So if I run the code, I expect true to be printed and another statement to be printed. And that is exactly what happened. But if I change the value to false, I expect nothing to be printed because both the statements seem to be inside the body of if, right? So let's run the code. And what do we see is another statement is getting printed. True is not getting printed, but another statement is getting printed. And that's happening because we did not use curly braces. So even if we have two statements over here, only one is getting considered in the body of if. That means if result is false, only this one will get affected. The other one is a statement which is outside the body of if. That means it will not be affected on the basis of the value of result. And that's what is happening over here. So if you want both the statements to be considered inside the body of if, then you have to use the pair of curly braces. And if I put these two statements inside the pair of curly braces and now I run the code, I'll get nothing printed on the screen. So this is about simple if. So now that we have understood how simple if works, let's solve a simple question using simple if. And the question is actually pretty simple. You will be given a number and you have to print even if it is even, just that. So if I give you, for example, 14, you will print even. If I give you, for example, 17, you'll print nothing. Now for this, the first thing that you will have to do is determine if 14 or 17 or any number for that matter is even, right? And if I give you 14, you can say it is even. And if I give you 17, you can say it is not even. But how are you able to do it? there must be some mental calculation that you're doing, right? What you are doing is you're dividing the number by 2 and you are collecting the remainder. Now, once you have the remainder, you are assessing if it is 0. And if it is 0, then you're saying that it is an even number, right? This is the whole process of finding whether number is even or not. So, how do we put this in code? Let's understand. For that, let's come back to IntelliJ and let's create a new Java class in the selection statements package. Let's say even number as the name of the class. Let's have a main method. And over here, let's take a variable called num and assign 14 to it. Now, what we need to do as per whatever we have discussed is we need to find the remainder. And to find the remainder, what we can do is use the modulus operator, right? Now, this is going to give us either 0 or 1 because we are dividing by 2. And the 0 or 1 that we will get is an integer. So we can say int remainder is equal to num mod 2. Now, what we need to do next is we need to check if remainder is 0, correct? And we know how we can do that, right? We can say if remainder is equal to 0, right? Now, in that case, all that we have to do is we have to print even. And if I run the code now, I should be getting even printed. But if I change this to, let's say, 17, and then I run the code, there should be nothing on the screen. And that's how our code is behaving. So this is how we can find if a number is even. Now, take a look at the condition that we have over here. We have said remainder is equal to 0, where remainder is num mod 2. So if I take num mod 2 from here, and if I get rid of remainder, and I paste num mod 2 here, will it still work the same way? Well, yes, it will. What's going to happen is num mod 2 will get executed and then it will be compared with 0. And if it is 0, then even will be printed, otherwise nothing will be printed. So if I run the code now, nothing will be printed. But if I change this from 17 to 14 and then run the code, even will get printed. So this is how simple if works. Now, in this example, we only printed even. We didn't print anything for 17, which is not even, which means it is odd. So how can we do that? Well, simple if will only have one condition and the body associated will only evaluate if the condition is true. In our case, taking 17 means the condition is false. And since condition is false, the body of if will not get executed. So what do we do next? Well, we use another variation of if, which is the if else. Over here, the first part that you see is similar to the syntax of simple if. But the second part has got an else. So what's going to happen here is you give a condition, and if that condition is true, the block associated to if will get executed. But if that condition is false, the block associated to else will get executed. That's how simple it is. So using the knowledge we have gained just now regarding if else, let's extend the previous program that we have written. What are we going to do now is we are going to print even if the number is even, and we are going to print odd if the number is odd. Now, before we jump to IntelliJ and we start writing the code, let's take a look at this syntax and try to figure out what we should be doing. Well, in the previous program, we put the condition as num mod 2 is equal to 0. And if this was true, we would print true. And if it was false, the control will get to the body of else. And in the body of else, we can print false, right? That's it. So let's come back to IntelliJ and let's create a new Java class. Let's name the class as even or odd number. Now over here, what am I going to do next is copy the public static void main that we have and paste it here. Now we already have if. All that we have to do is copy the println statement, have an else, and paste the copied println statement and change it to print odd. So if I run the code now, I will get even. But if I run the code with 17 as num, I'll get odd printed on the screen. So this is how if else works. Summarizing, simple if will have a condition and the body associated or block associated to simple if will execute if and only if the condition is true. But there's an extension of simple if, which is if else. Over here, it also takes a condition and the body associated to if executes if and only if the condition is true. But if the condition is false, the body associated to else executes. Now, in both if and if else, you can see that there's just one condition. But what if, for some reason or to solve some problem, we need to assess or evaluate more than one condition? For example, if condition 1 is true, then execute these set of statements. But if condition 1 is not true, then check another condition. And if that is true, then evaluate these statements. But if even the second condition is not true, then check the third one and then evaluate the statements if the third condition is true. And if none of the condition is true, then evaluate these statements. For example, if we have a scenario or a situation like this, if else won't help. And of course, simple if also won't help. Now, what will help here? Well, if else if ladder will help. The syntax of if else if ladder will tell you how. As you can see, it has got an if similar to simple if and if else, which takes one condition. And if the condition is true, the block associated to that condition will get executed. But if that condition is false, it will check another condition if the another condition is present. That is, if the else if block is present. Now, if condition 2 is true, then this block will get executed. But if condition 2 is false, it will check another condition if there is one. Now, if condition 3 is true, then this block will get executed. And this will continue happening. But if none of the condition is true, then it will go to the else block and execute the statements associated to the else block. Now over here, there's one more important point, and that is the else that you see is optional. That means you can have if, else if, and a lot of else if without an else at the end. So what is going to happen in that case is, if none of the conditions above are true, then nothing is going to happen. But if one of the conditions above is true, then the block associated to that condition, which evaluated to true, will get executed. Also, another important point over here is only one of the blocks here will get executed. For example, let's assume that for a certain expression that we have, both condition 1 and condition 2 are true. But condition 1 is coming first in the ladder. And because of that, once condition 1 evaluates to true, condition 2, condition 3, and so on will not even be checked. But if condition 1 evaluates to false, it will check condition 2. And if condition 2 also evaluates to false, then it will check condition 3 and so on. So long story short, if you have an if else if ladder, only one block will get executed. And that block could either be associated to a condition that evaluated to true, or it could be associated to else. But if else is not there and no condition evaluates to true, then none of the block will get executed. So with this clear, let us solve a question using if else if ladder. So let's say we have got a number in a variable called num. Now what we want to do is we want to assess if it is positive or negative or zero. So how can we do it? Well, to check if a number is positive, you'll have to do this: num greater than 0, right? To check if a number is negative, you'll have to do this: num less than 0. And to check if a number is 0, you'll have to do this: num equal to 0, right? Now you can see three conditions over here, and three conditions being present to solve a question is a perfect indication that you need an if else if ladder, right? So with this clear, let's write code. For that, let's go to IntelliJ. Let's close these two files and let's create a new Java class. Let's name this Java class as positive, negative, or 0. And then let's have a main method. Now in the main method, let's have a variable called num, to which we will assign, for example, 14. Now as we have discussed, we will need an if else if ladder. So we'll start off with an if, and we will say num greater than 0. Now if it is greater than 0, we will print positive. But if that is not the case, then we need to check if num is less than 0 or not, right? So we'll say else if num less than 0, and we will print negative. But let's say both of these conditions are false. That means num is for sure equal to 0. So now you've got two options. You can either go for this: num equal to 0, and you can print 0 over here, or you can get rid of the if that you have over here and you can leave it just to else. So let's run this code now. That is the one with an else at the end. So if I run the code with 14, I get positive. If I run the code with minus 14, what do I get? Negative. And if I run the code with 0, I get 0. Now, if I put the if from here with the else, thereby making it an else if block, what if I run the code? I get 0 again. And if I put the num as 14, I get positive. If I put the value as minus 14, I get negative. So you see, the program is behaving exactly the same way in both the cases. That is the one where we ended with else if num equal to 0, and the other one where we ended with just else. And this is because there are only 3 possible conditions, out of which we have checked the 2 here. So if you check the third one or not, it would give you the same result. So this is how the if else if ladder works. Now, the next variation that we have is called nested if. And there's no specific syntax of nested if. And that is because a nested if, in simpler terms, is one variation of if inside another variation of if. For example, take this. We've got a simple if, right? Now, inside the body of simple if, you can see another simple if. So this is an example of nested if. Another example could be this. We've got an if else, right? But inside the body or the block associated to else, we can see another simple if. Similarly, take this one. We've got a simple if, but inside the body of simple if or in the block associated to simple if, we can see an if else. Or take this one for example. We've got an if else. And what you can see is inside the body of if, we've got an if else if ladder. And furthermore, inside the body of else that is associated to this if else if ladder, we've got another simple if. So this is another example of nested if. And that is why I said nested if does not really have a syntax. It is just one variation of if inside another variation of if. That is it. So with this clear, let's solve a question. Now, so far we have solved this question. We checked if a number was even or odd. And the other one was where we checked if a number is positive or negative or 0. Now let's combine these two. Let's say we want to check if a number is even positive or if a number is even negative or if a number is odd positive or odd negative or finally 0. So in order to check this, what will we have to do? Well, first of all, we will have to figure out if it is even or odd, right? Now, if it is even, then we'll have to figure out if it is positive or negative or 0. Similarly, we'll have to do the same thing if the number was odd. So positive, negative or 0. And I think you know where I'm going with this, right? What we will have to do is use nested if. We will first of all have to check if a number is even or odd. Now, once we have that figured out, we will then have to check if the number is positive, negative or 0, right? Also, this can be modified a little because if let's say you enter 0 as the value of num, what's going to happen is it will always get inside the body of even. So if it is even, we can check if it is positive, negative or 0. But if it is odd, we can just check for positive or negative because a number which is odd will never be equal to 0. So let's modify the logic that we had discussed and let's stick to this one. So with this clear, let's first of all discuss how are we going to write the code and then actually go and write the code. Now, what we need to do first of all is check if it is even or odd, right? For that, we can go for num mod 2. And if I go for num mod 2, I'll get either 0 or 1. Then we can check if it is 0 or not. If it is 0, that means this will be for even. We will go for further checks. But if it is not 0, that means it will be 1. We will have an else which will have checks of its own. Now in the body of if and else, what will we have to do? Well, we will have to check if the number is positive, negative, or 0 in the body of if. And in the body of else, we'll have to check for positive or negative. Now translating this into code, how will it look like? It will look like this. If number is greater than 0, then do something. And then we'll say else if number less than 0, then do something. And lastly, we can have an else, which means it was 0. Similarly, we will have conditions here as well. So with this clear, let's go to IntelliJ, close this file, create another class in selection statements, and let's name this as even, odd, positive, negative, 0. Now you must have noticed that I'm putting names which signify what the class might contain. But truth be told, these names are not very clear. So do not draw inspiration from this. This is just for the purpose of demonstration, and also because I don't want to burden you with all of the good programming practices all at once. But in case you're interested, let me know in the comments and I'll make a dedicated video on that. Now, what are we supposed to do is have a variable called num and assign some value to it. Next, we will need to check if num when divided by 2 gives 0 as remainder or not. So if it is 0 as remainder, that means this is even. Otherwise, it is odd. So let's put this comment. Now, if it is even, what do we need to do? We need to check if it is greater than 0 or not. And if it is greater than 0, it means it is even positive. Otherwise, we will have to check if it is less than 0 or not. And if it is less than 0, then it is even negative. And lastly, we will have an else, which will be 0. Because if it is even, but neither positive nor negative, the only option that we are left with is 0, right? Now coming to the else block, where we will land if and only if the number is an odd number, we will have to check positive or negative. So we can either say this if num greater than 0 and else if num less than 0, or we can say this if num greater than 0 and then else. Now having the nested if ready, let us put the print statements. So here we'll say even, positive. Then here we'll say even, negative. And here we will say 0. Similarly, here we will say odd positive. And here we will say odd negative. Now let's take 16 as an example and run the code. And we should get even positive, which is what we are getting. If I change this to say minus 16 and then run the code, I will get even negative. Now, if I change this to say minus 11, I should get odd negative. If I change this to plus 11, I'll get even negative. I'm sorry, odd negative. And if I change this to 0, I should get 0. And that's what we got, which means the code that we have written is working perfectly fine. And this is one of the applications of nested if. So with this, we have completed all of the variations of if, that is simple if else if ladder, and nested if. So let's quickly recap. In case of simple if, there's just one condition and a block associated to that condition. And if the condition evaluates to true, that block will be executed. Otherwise, the block will not be executed. Now over here, we had discussed about curly braces, and we discussed that if there are more than one statements that we want to include in if, then we have to use curly braces. But if we have just one statement, we are fine with or without using curly braces. Now moving on to if else, this also has a condition. And if the condition is true, there's a block associated to it which gets executed. But if the condition is false, there's an else block which gets executed, which is in a way an extension of the simple if. And both if and simple if works with just one condition. But if we have a scenario or a situation where we need to check multiple conditions, then we have got the if else if ladder that we can use. Over here, we can have if and multiple else if, and an optional else which will come at the very end. Now, if we have something like this, what's going to happen is it will start from the very top and execute the conditions. Now, if the condition is false, it will move on to the next one. And if even that is false, it will move on to the next one and ultimately to the very end. And if there is an else, the block associated to else will get executed. But if there's no else and none of these conditions were true, then nothing will get executed. Now, while checking the condition, if let's say this one evaluates to true, in that case, the conditions that are after the condition which evaluated to true will not be executed, which means in an if-else-if ladder, which starts evaluating the condition from the very top, it stops right after it has come across one condition which evaluated to true. So this was about if-else-if ladder. Then we also talked about nested if, which in simpler terms is one variation of if inside another variation of if. Now, if I go back to simple if, you can see that we have an if but no else. So this might raise a question that if we can have an if without an else, can we have an else without an if? Well, let's try this out. For that, let me create another class and let's call this class as demo, for example. And here, let's have a main method. Now, if I put just else and a body, and inside the body I say, for example, else, you can see that we are getting an error. And if I still run the code, it will say else without if, which means if can exist without an else, but an else cannot exist without an if. And the reason is pretty obvious, right? If is governed by a condition. So if the condition is true, the block associated to if will get executed. Similarly, if we take example of if else, what happens is if the condition is true, the block associated to if gets executed. But if the condition is false, the block associated to else gets executed. But how will we decide if this should be executed or not? Because there's no condition, right? So an else cannot exist without an if. And like we discussed for the if-else-if ladder, that is only one block will get executed. The same thing holds for if-else also. And this again is pretty obvious. The condition will either be true or it will be false. So if it is true, the block associated to if gets executed. If it is false, the block associated to else gets executed. It cannot, of course, be true and false at the same time, right? Now, all of these discussions about block must have triggered a discussion we had earlier, that is scope and lifetime of variables, where what we had discussed was that a block will begin with an opening curly brace and it will end with a closing curly brace. And that held true for the main method, and it will also hold true for if, it will also hold true for else, and it will also hold true for if else. That is, each of these things that you see over here is a block. Now, what is the significance of block, you may ask? So a block defines a scope. That is, when a block is defined, a scope starts. And when a block ends, the scope ends. And what is the significance of scope? Well, a scope will determine what objects are visible to other parts of your program. For example, let's say I go to demo, and over here what I do is I have an if, and I say if num greater than 0, I want to print, say, positive. I'll of course have to declare the variable num and assign a value to it. So let's do that. So what I have done over here is I have created a block, which means there's a scope over here. And the scope determines which objects are visible to other parts of the program. Now over here, we have just one println statement. But what if I get rid of this and I declare another variable, say num2? As you can see, there's no error, which means it is completely fine to do so. The program compiled and executed successfully. So if I have num2 over here, and if I say, for example, 18, and I print num2 in the body of if itself. Now, if I run the code, I'll get 18 printed, right? But if I want to do the same thing outside the body of if, you can see this turn to red. And if I run the code, we get an error which says cannot find symbol. Which symbol? num2, which is a variable. And where is that symbol present? That is present inside a class called demo, which is in the selection statements package. So what is happening over here is since we have declared a variable called num2 in the block of if, num2 cannot be accessed outside the block of if. So to summarize this, if we have a variable defined inside a scope, it will not be available or visible to the code outside that scope, which is what we're doing here in line number 13. Now, this is not the only block. There's another block that we have, right? Which is the block associated to the main method. And we have a variable inside the block associated to main method. So now the question is this variable, that is num, accessible inside the body of if? Well, let's try that out. But before that, let's get rid of the print statement that we have on line number 13. And over here, let's say I print num. Well, we cannot see any errors, but let's run the code and check. So we got 10 and we got 18. So what is happening over here? So if we take the main method into consideration, we've got a block. Now the block of main method contains another block, which is the one associated to if. So you can treat the block associated to main method as the outer block and the block associated to if as the inner block, which means this is one scope, that is the one associated to main, and this is another scope, and the one associated to main is the outer scope, the one associated to if is the inner scope. And this situation is called a nested scope. So in a nested scope, the variables that you define in the outer scope will be accessible inside the inner scope as well. And it is pretty obvious and simple to understand. What we know is a variable defined in a scope will be accessible in that scope itself, right? So if I define num in the scope of main and the block of if also falls within the scope of main, that means num variable should be accessible inside the block of if also. And that's what is happening. Also, there's another important point, and that is since a variable defined in the outer scope is accessible inside the inner scope, you cannot have a variable with the same name in both the scopes. For example, if I change num2 to num, you will get an error. Let me get rid of the statement on line number 11. So you see, we are getting an error and it says variable num is already defined in the scope. What it means is we have a variable called num in the same scope. And that is why this is not allowed. So let me change it back to num2. Now answer me this. We cannot have num defined in the block associated to if because we already have a variable called num in the same scope. But can we, after the block associated to if, declare a variable and call it num2? What do you think would happen if I end this statement with a semicolon? Will it give us an error or not? Let's find out. So if I put a semicolon, you can see that it is not giving an error. And if you're thinking why, let me tell you that this is happening because we have declared num2 in line number 13, right? And this falls within the block associated to main. Now take a look at the block associated to main and take a look at the variables that are defined in the block associated to main. There's only one except num2, which is num. We can see num2 being defined in the block associated to if. But as we know, the lifetime of a variable is defined by its scope, which means as soon as this curly brace is encountered, num2 is no longer valid. And since num2 is no longer valid, we can declare another variable called num2 in the scope associated to the main method. So this is all about scope and lifetime of variables. You already knew about this, but then you knew about scope and lifetime in relation to the main method only. And because of that, we could not discuss the concept of nested scope. But now, having introduced the if block, we can discuss the concept of nested scope, which means there were a few more important points related to the scope and lifetime of variables which were pending, which we have now discussed. Now, with this completed, let's move on to the next topic, which is ternary operator. Now, if you're wondering why are we discussing ternary operator over here when we have dedicated videos on different types of operator, it is because understanding ternary operator needs understanding of if else. And because we did not discuss if else then, there was no point discussing ternary operator. But now that we know what if else is, we can discuss ternary operator. So let's quickly recap whatever we have discussed related to if else, which is it will have a condition and a block, and then it will also have else and a block, right? Now, the reason I'm talking about if else is because ternary operator is in a way a replacement of if else. Ternary operator uses these two symbols. Let's see how does this work. So first of all, we write condition and then we give a question mark. Now, if we have a condition, it can either evaluate to true or false, right? So whatever action we want to perform when it evaluates to true is written, and then we give a colon. And then whatever action we want to perform when it evaluates to false is given. So if you take a look at it, it is in a way a replacement of if else that we know about. If the condition is true, this will get evaluated, and if the condition is false, this will get evaluated. So with this clear, let's come to IntelliJ and let's close all of the tabs and let's open even or odd number where we have used if else. Now, if we were to do the same thing using ternary operator, what can we do? Well, we will first of all grab the condition that we have, right? Then we will give a question mark. Now, what do we want to happen if the condition is true? Well, we want to print even, right? So if I grab it and paste it over here with a semicolon and then give a colon, and then for the else, if I grab this and paste, you can see that we are getting a few errors, and we are getting an error over here because ternary operator gives a value. So if the condition is true, it will give some value, and if the condition is false, it will give another value. And what we have done is we have put system.out.println even in the true part, and the false part we have put system.out.println odd. And that is why it is giving an error, because system.out.println is not giving a value back. So what if I do this? Instead of going for system.out.println even, what if I just take even and put in the true part? And similarly, for the false part, what if I take odd and put it over here and end this statement with a semicolon? We are still getting an error, and this time the error is because it is not a statement, and that's happening because, as I said, ternary operator gives a value, and if it gives a value, we need to use some variable to store that value. And since the value that it is giving is string, we need to use a string variable. So let's say string result, and now you can see that the error vanished. And if I print the value of result, what would I get? Well, I'll get odd printed twice, and that's because we took num as 17, and it will print twice, first in the if else and second one because of ternary operator. And if I change this to 18, I'll get even printed twice. So let's run the code, and that's what happened. So like I said, ternary operator is in a way a replacement of if else, but it is a replacement of if else in those cases where you would expect to return some value. So with this, we come to the end of the video. Summarizing, we talked about selection statements, where we got to know that selection statements can be broadly categorized in if and switch. There are 4 variations of if, which is what we focused on in this video. And those 4 variations are simple if else if ladder, and nested if. Then we continued our discussion and talked about scope and lifetime of variables. And lastly, we talked about ternary operator. So I hope I've been able to teach you something new and useful. If you have any suggestions, feedback, or queries, feel free to put them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.